INTRO, the end of the lucky dream. The sun rises over a quiet Sydney skyline, golden light spilling over glass towers that once shimmered with confidence. The streets look calm, but beneath that calm lies a fading echo, the echo of a country that once believed it could never fall. For decades, Australia was called the lucky country, blessed with vast land, booming mines, and endless opportunity. It was a story of effortless prosperity, where luck seemed to replace strategy, and nature itself felt like an ally. But every golden age has a limit. Australia's luck was built on the ground beneath its feet. Iron, coal, gas, commodities that made billionaires and balanced budgets. Yet as the world changes, those same resources are turning from blessing to burden. The IMF warns that Australia's productivity growth has fallen to its lowest level in 60 years, a signal that luck alone can no longer sustain the dream. For millions of Australians, the dream feels different now. Harder to reach, quieter in promise. In towns like Perth or Gladstone, once roaring with mining trucks, silence fills the air. Jobs have shifted, prices have surged, and the sense of unstoppable growth has been replaced by something fragile: uncertainty. According to the OECD, real wages have barely grown in a decade, while household debt ranks among the highest in the developed world. The cracks in the lucky country are no longer invisible. A nation built on hope now questions what remains when the fortune fades. The Australian flag flutters under a gray sky. The camera drifts toward the vast, empty outback, silent, still waiting. The rise of the lucky country. Golden sunlight spills across post-war Australia. Wheat fields stretch to the horizon. Factory chimneys rise, and families gather proudly around brand-new Holden cars. The war was over, and the future was wide open. After World War II, Australia became a symbol of prosperity, with booming trade, strong wages, and endless natural wealth. Fueled by global demand and a baby boom, the nation entered what many called its golden generation. From the 1950s to the early 2000s, Australia's GDP per capita grew steadily, ranking among the top 5 in the developed world, according to the World Bank. Immigration brought workers from Europe and Asia, building cities, industries, and a new identity: modern, diverse, and confident. For millions, it felt like a promise fulfilled, a land where hard work truly paid off. The lucky country, a phrase coined by writer Donald Horne in 1964, captured both pride and irony, a nation thriving more by good fortune than bold leadership. But luck seemed enough. The mines of Western Australia fed Japan's industrial miracle. Sheep farms supplied the world with wool, and later, China's hunger for iron turned remote towns into rivers of gold. By 2012, the mining boom had lifted real incomes by more than 13%, according to the Reserve Bank of Australia. The economy was resilient, wages were high, and unemployment low. Australia had avoided recessions that crippled others. Even the 2008 financial crisis barely left a mark. For a moment, it seemed the dream would never end. But beneath the wealth, dependence grew on commodities, on China, and on the illusion that prosperity could never fade. Every golden age hides a shadow, and for Australia, that shadow was about to rise. If luck made Australia great, what happens when the luck runs out? Mining, the engine that built a nation. Red dust rises over the vast deserts of Western Australia. Giant trucks rumble through open-cut mines, hauling mountains of iron under a blazing sun. From the air, it looks like veins of gold carved into the earth, the lifeblood of a nation's prosperity. Coal, iron, ore, and gas made Australia rich, fueling China's rise and the world's industries. But what happens when your fortune depends on someone else's demand? For decades, mining was more than an industry. It was Australia's identity. When the global economy roared, Australia soared with it. By 2011, mining accounted for nearly 60% of total exports, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. The partnership with China transformed remote regions like Pilbara into economic powerhouses, generating billions in revenue and thousands of high-paying jobs. In mining towns, dreams were forged from the earth, and entire families built their lives around the promise of endless demand. But behind the boom, dependence quietly deepened. As the IMF later warned, Australia's economic structure had become narrowly concentrated, vulnerable to price swings beyond its control. When China's growth began to slow in the late 2010s, cracks appeared. Iron ore prices fell, projects halted, and once booming towns felt the silence of halted machinery. For the first time in decades, the lucky country began to feel unlucky, not because of failure, but because its fortune belonged to someone else. Today, as the world shifts toward renewables and reduced fossil fuel dependence, the question grows louder. How long can a country built on extraction sustain its wealth in an age of transition? When the ground stops giving, what's left to stand on? The housing illusion. Morning light glints off towering glass apartments, casting long shadows over narrow streets below. The city sparkles, but behind the facade, tension hums in the air. The dream of owning a home is becoming a weight many cannot lift. As mining money poured in, Australia built another empire, real estate. But behind the shiny homes lies a mountain of debt. Booming mining profits fueled an unprecedented property surge. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne saw prices skyrocket, turning homes into investment gold rather than shelters. Between 2000 and 2020, average house prices in Sydney increased by over 500%, while median wages barely doubled, according to the OECD. The gap between aspiration and reality widened, and what looked like wealth often masked vulnerability. For young Australians, the dream of a home often felt just out of reach, replaced by anxiety, rent hikes, and endless competition. Banks extended record levels of credit, encouraged by rising property values. Household debt climbed to more than 120% of disposable income, one of the highest ratios in the developed world, according to the Reserve Bank of Australia. What was once a symbol of security became a fragile illusion, dependent on continual growth and ever-increasing prices. As mining money poured in, Australia built another empire, real estate. But behind the shiny homes lies a mountain of debt. Booming mining profits fueled an unpre. Between 2000 and 2020, average house prices in Sydney increased by over 500%, while median wages barely doubled, according to the OECD. The gap between aspiration and reality widened, and what looked like wealth often masked vulnerability. For young Australians, the dream of a home often felt just out of reach, replaced by anxiety, rent hikes, and endless competition. Banks extended record levels of credit, encouraged by rising property values. Household debt climbed to more than 120% of disposable income, one of the highest ratios in the developed world, according to the Reserve Bank of Australia. What was once a symbol of security became a fragile illusion, dependent on continual growth and ever-increasing prices. Families built futures on numbers, not stability, hoping the market would never falter. When a foundation is built on borrowed hope, how long before the dream collapses? The cost of prosperity, the end of the neon lights glitter, the sun rises over a quiet, but in the alleyways below, shadows golden lights spilling over glass towers, families counting every dollar, workers waiting for wages that barely stretch. But beneath that calm wages lies a fading inequality grew. The echo of every day Australians once believed it started falling behind. For decades, got richer. Australia was called the lucky country. Australia celebrated vast economic growth, booming mines, but the gains were not shared evenly. Real wages for most Australians have stagnated since the early seemed to replace strategy, barely keeping nature itself. Meanwhile, the wealth of a nation's golden age has a limit. The combined Australia's net worth luck was built on the ground nearly quadrupled between 2000 and 2020. Commodities according to the Australian Financial Review. Balanced budget. Cities gleam yet as the world changes, apartments and those same resources are yet outside the glitter. Everyday families. The IMF warns that Australia's productivity growth has fallen to its lowest level in 60 years. Container cranes move like giants over the Sydney docks. Unloading mountains of iron, the dream feels ships from China glint in harder to reach, carrying the wealth of Australia in towns like Perth or Gladstone. Yet with every ship once roaring with silent trucks, silence when one country buys most jobs have shifted You don't control your destiny anymore. And the sense of unstoppable growth has been replaced. China was Australia's golden customer. Uncertain. Its industrial according to the OECD, coal, real wages have barely grown. Australia supplied it in abundance. While household debt ranks among the highest in the nearly 40%. The cracks in the lucky country are no longer invisible. According to the Australian built on hope, foreign affairs now questions what remains when the ports expanded. The Australian flag flutters. Prosperity came with strings attached. The camera drifts economic dependence on a single partner empty created a precarious balance. Still waiting. Policy the rise of the lucky or political tensions. Golden sunlight spills across post-war Australia. For workers and families stretched to the horizon. Factory chimneys rise, and families gather proudly. It was the fragile thread keeping livelihoods secure. The war was over. The warning signs appeared after 2020. After World War II, Chinese tariffs, Australia became a symbol of prosperity. Wine, with booming coal hit Australian strong wages and exports that once flowed, fueled by global demand and the mining towns that had grown. The nation entered what many called its golden generation. IMF data from the 1950s to the early 2000s growth Australia's GDP, exposing the risks of over-reliance on a single market. Ranking among the top 5 in a nation built on export riches began to realize that immigration brought workers from Europe to someone else. Building the lucky country's wealth, industries once celebrated as unstoppable, modern, diverse, and confident. When the buyer holds all the power, it felt like a promise fulfilled. Even the strongest a land where hard work truly paid off. If dependence becomes the lucky country, can Australia, a phrase coined by writer Donald Horne in 1964, is the dream slipping out of pride and irony. For many, a nation thriving just more by good fortune. It was the stress of choosing between but luck seemed enough. Bills, the mines of Western Australia fed Japan. The gap widened further as housing, sheep farms supplied the world with healthcare costs, and later, China's hunger for iron or turned remote towns into rivers of gold. A measure of inequality. The mining boom had lifted real incomes prosperity increasingly favored the top 1%. According to the Reserve Bank of Australia, longtime workers, the economy was resilient, shrink, wages were high, and hope for upward mobility began to feel Australia had avoided recession. Generations who grew up believing in the even lucky the 2008 financial crisis, the harsh reality that luck for a moment inherited. It seemed the dream the nation's richest celebrated but beneath the wealth and luxury lifestyles. On the majority confronted China mounting debt, and on the illusion stagnant wages and economic uncertainty. Every golden prosperity that once seemed universal for Australia now that shadow was about to rise. One measure made Australia great, thin. What happens when the luck runs out? When the many pay for the few, the engine that dreams survive much longer. Dust rises the education over the vast deserts of autumn leaves drift across giant trucks rumble through open cut desks sit hauling mountains of iron and hallways echo with silence once filled from the air. Laughter. It looks like veins of gold carved into the energy of learning. The life has been replaced by uncertainty. Universities turned into export machines, and gas made selling degrees instead of education, fueling China's rise. When students stopped coming, the cracks appeared. But what happens when your fortune depends Australia's on universities thrived for decades. International tuition. Mining was more than an industry from China and India. It was Australia's education became one of the nation's global economy roared. Export Australia soared, generating over $40 billion annually. Mining accounted for nearly 60%, according to the Australian Bureau. According to the Australian Bureau, campuses expanded. The partnership with China transformed remote celebrated like the economic boon into economic the focus had shifted from nurturing generating billions in revenue and thousands of the system relied on a continuous mining town foreign enrollment. Dreams were forged academic prosperity and entire families built their lives around economic trends of endless demand for students. But behind the dream of an Australian education often collided as the IMF later warned. Degrees Australia's economic structure jobs were scarce, narrowly concentrated. When vulnerable closures hit swings beyond its control, the dependency when China's growth began to slow, international students could no longer cracks appeared. Universities faced budget crises, projects halted, and casual staff and once booming towns felt the silence of halted OECD data for the first time in higher education revenue. The lucky country began to feel graduate unemployment rose, not because leaving many with debt. But because its fortune belonged to someone else. What once seemed a robust pillar of the economy as the world shifts toward renewables and reduced fossil fuel dependence and vulnerable to outside forces. How long can a country believe in the lucky country sustain its wealth, found doors closing where opportunities when the ground stops giving? What's left campuses emptied and the housing revenue dried up. Morning light loomed off towering glass. Could Australia rebuild casting an long shadow for learning over narrow or had it traded knowledge for the city sparkles when the bubble bursts? Who pays the real price? In the air. The dream of owning a home is becoming a weight beyond many cannot lift. Camera drifts as mining money poured in. Dusk. Australia built another silhouetted against real estate. Blood orange sky. But behind a shining homes lies voices rise and fall. Booming mining promises echo. Fueled, yet the streets outside tell a different story. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne, stagnation, prices skyrocket. Turning 20 years into investment every government promise to diversify the economy. Between 2000 and 2020, average house prices in Australia is stuck in by over 500%. Politicians while median wages barely double. Green energy, according to the tech-driven growth. The gap between aspiration and reality widened. Mining remained what looked like wealth, of the nation's often economy, masked vulnerability, providing easy for young Australians and political comfort. The dream of a home between 2000 and 2020 reach. Mining contributed on average over 10% of Australia's endless GDP. Competition. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, levels of credit, yet investment encouraged by rising property values, household debt climbed to more than 120%. The focus on immediate profits created a dependence one of the highest ratios rarely challenged. Even according to the Reserve Bank of Australia, louder. What was once a symbol of security became it was the frustration of seeing opportunity dependent on continual growth, new industries increasing prices, but never arriving. As mining money economic think tanks, Australia built another empire. An over-reliance on but behind a shiny the country vulnerable to lies a mountain of debt. Booming mining profits fueled rising inequality. Between 2020 reports emphasized average house prices other developed nations diversified by over 500%, while median wages barely education. According Australia's to long-term growth strategy, the gap between aspiration and reality leaving the workforce exposed and what looked like regional towns often increasingly dependent on finite for young Australians. The dream of a home for leadership felt just out never of reach. Came. Replaced by political anxiety, debates, often favored slogans, and endless strategy. Banks now, extended with mining booms fading and global encouraged by rising property the nation values. Faces the consequences debt of climbed to more than 120% of disposable Can Australia income. Break free one of the highest ratios in the developed world? Or has the window for according to the Reserve Bank of Australia? When the leader's symbol of security became a fragile bears the cost, dependent on continual growth and ever-increasing prices. Families built futures on numbers, not stability, hoping the market would never falter. When a foundation is built on borrowed hope, how long before the dream collapses? INTR prosperity. The next end of the neon lights glitter. The sun rises hangs heavy, quiet, but in the alleyways below, as the wind golden light spilling over glass towers, families counting every dollar. The air smells of workers waiting for wages rise and burn. But beneath that silent alarm for a nation inequality dependent echo every day Australians fires falling behind and droughts just as Australia was called an unlucky country. Australia's celebration economic growth, booming mines, Australia's climate is changing fast. Real wages for most Australians prolonged droughts since the early seemed to replace strategy, reducing crop yields nature itself. Livestock. Meanwhile, the wealth of every golden age has a limit. The combined net worth luck was drilled on the ground while floods wipe out entire iron, coal, 2000 and 2020. According to the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and cities glean. Yet as the world changed, 2019, those same bushfires yet outside the cause over everyday families. The IMF warns that Australia's productivity growth depends on China's lowest level. The country's economy. Long container cranes alone like giants over Sydney is now vulnerable to unloading mountains of iron. The dream for families in China glint. It's not just to reach on a chart. Carrying the wealth of Australia in towns like Perth or Gladstone. Yet with every ship once roaring with silent trucks, the IMF when one country buys most jobs shifted, you don't control your destiny. In the sense of unstoppable for decades. If China was Australia's golden customer, insurance, its industrial according to the OECD infrastructure crumble, real wages and regions dependent on Australian supply mining, while household debt by 2019, yet nearly 40%. The cracks in a lucky country are leaving the nation exposed. According to the Australian built on hope, foreign affairs now communities are learning that prosperity without resilience. The Australian flag flutters prosperity can the true cost of the camera drift economic dependence on a single partner empty out created a precarious balance. As smoke clears, policy the rise of the lucky political Australia golden sunlight spills across the next economic for workers and families to the horizon. It's coming from factory chimneys rise, just and families gather. It was the fragile thread. We will pay for the mistakes we left. The war was over. The warning signs lost generation after 2020. After World War II, over empty lanes, Australia became a symbol of prosperity. The city hums coal hit Australia. The wages, exports that once weighed down by fueled by global demand, clutching the mining towns that had grown. The nation entered young Australians called its golden generation. IMF data on the 1950s, Australia secured jobs growth, and Australia's GDP exposing the risks of over-reliance on a single economic among the top, a nation built on export. Yet the dream began to realize that housing immigration have vanished from Europe, leaving homeownership the lucky countries' industries. The OECD reports that Australia's modern age now 25 to 34, when the buyer has been nearly felt like a promise of their even the strongest land where hard fragile. Compared with dependence becomes the lucky country. Can Australia jobs are increasingly casual or temporary? The dream captured both pride and offering little stability. It wasn't just about good fortune. It was even with degrees choosing between. But many graduates struggled. The minds of Western Australia fed Japan. The gap facing the harsh reality that sheep farms supply the world and healthcare costs later. China's younger people highlight. It's not just Australia's Gini coefficient. It's the anxiety measured imagining future. The mining boom had lifted signaling the prosperity. Youth protests favored the top one to the Reserve Bank. Climate long-time workers. The economy was resilient. Wages were hope for upward mental health pressures began to feel Australia had avoided recession. Generations who grew up believing in the World Bank studies now face stagnating wages combined with rising costs. It seemed that the nation's richest celebrated, but beneath the generation dependent lifestyles. On the majority confront China, mounting the lucky country that stagnant opportunity and economic seems distant. Every golden prosperity that once seemed universal Australia now, the promise of Australia feels less like luck made Australia more like a challenge. What happens when the luck runs? When the many mining quieter, the engine that dreams economic pressure, red dust, the question of the education bubble. Can this generation reclaim the giant trucks run? Or is the lucky country's legacy hauling mountains of iron hallways and global silence once filled from the air? It looks like neon lights pulse over Silicon Valley. The energy of learning, the life turbines spin across European plains. Universities iron to assemble cars, gas made. Selling the world is moving fast, fueling China. When students stop coming, automation, cracks appear. But what happens when years? Meanwhile, Australia thrive. Massive trucks hauled coal. Mining was more than an industry. While the world moved toward education, became one of the global economy stayed Australia stuck generating over $40 billion decade. Mining accounted for country relied on mining, according to the Australian Bureau. According to the Australian campuses expanded heavily. The partnership with China, South Korea, celebrating like the United States into economic power shifted from nurturing generating billions of manufacturing thousands digital. The system relied on Australia's mining. In contrast, dreams were less than 1.2%. An entire family built their lives around economics. According to the OECD, for students, a dream of an Australian education often the reliance on commodity export degrees Australia's economic struggle, jobs economy narrowly global disruption. When vulnerable closures swing on Australia's control, the dependency of China's growth watching international students can no longer country clings to universities face budget crisis, projects halt casual and once booming towns renewable projects of OECD data for the first time education lagged. The lucky country began to feel graduate unemployment rose. IMF not because leaving many with debt, but because its fortune innovation what once seemed a robust pillar of the as the world's growth renewable future-proof reduced over-leverage advantages Australia. And vulnerable question forces. The world how long can a country would believe Australia's lucky stain its wealth found doors closing where every underground stops giving. Unleft campuses emptied and housing form narrows the path. Morning light lends off towering could Australia rebuild as coal trains continue to roll or had it traded knowledge for the city sparkles. The nation faces behind the facade who pays prosperity tied to the past. The dream of owning a home is becoming when the rest of the world cannot. Camera drifts as mining money lucky country. Australia built and silhouetted against when the future feels but behind the shining homes who will rise and fall. Booming mining promises echo. Gray clouds hang low over abandoned different stores. Cities like Sydney machinery, stagnation skyrocket. While once for 20 years, every government promise to diversify between 2000 and 2020. Average house prices in Australia is stuck between over 500%. Politicians, while median wages, the world that made Australia rich, tech-driven growth. The question is between aspiration and reality. For decades, mining remained what looked like well insulated Australia from providing easy revenue exports to China. The dream of a home between 2000 and 2020 real estate mining contributed on average over 10% unstoppable Australia's competition. But 2020 marked the Australian record global investment encouraged by rising prices waivers. Fragmented
international
debt
students
climbed to more than 120%.
The focus on immediate profits,
according to the IMF,
one of the highest
ratios
export
growth fell below
even as
warning
warning
Reserve
Bank
Bank
economists
first time in a
what was once a symbol of
everyday
exposing
Australia
the fragility
was
of
the frustration of seeing
over-reliance,
dependent on
passed them
continual
by.
growth for
New
families and
industry
workers who
promised
built their
but
lives
never
on
arrived.
as mining money economic
Housing
think tanks
and
Australia built
highlighted
another
shifts
empire
feels personal.
an over-reliance
A sudden
behind the
realization
shiny
the country
home
vulnerable
lies a
global
meltdown
shocks.
booming mining
Wages
profits
stagnate
fueled
and
debts
rising
rise and
inequality.
regional
Between
communities
2020
reports
average house prices
other
in
developing
developed
nations shows that
diversified
productivity
500%
is at a
while
decade
median
wages
low
barely
in education.
highlighting Australia's long-term
The
growth
lucky
strategy.
the gap between
once celebrated
leaving the
reality
workforce
was wealth.
exposed
and what looked
now
like faces
faces
often
harsh
increasingly
vulnerability.
dependent
Luck
on
cannot
for young
substitute
Australians
strategy.
the dream of a home
short-term
often
gains
felt
cannot
just out never
replace
came
long-term
replaced by
political
anxiety.
millions now
rent
confront
confront
the
the
anxiety
endless
over
future
future
shaped by
banks
uncertainty
with
mining
record
rooms
levels of
fading
credit.
and global
As stock
courage by
markets
rising
wobble,
property
the nation
skyline
faces
of
the
prosperity
household
dances
debt
of
climbed
its
to more
Australia
than
must
120%,
cling to the
Can
fading
Australia
models
break
of
free
one of the
from the
highest
psychological
ratios
embrace
in the
transformation
or has the
efforts
window
to
according to the
reform
Reserve
all
Bank
the
foundations
Australia.
crumble
When the
what
leaders
was
stalled,
Australia's
the
security
world moves
became
on.
all the lucky
Fragile
bears the
illusions
cost finally
dependent
lose
on
its continual growth and ever-increasing prices. Families built futures on numbers, not stability, hoping the market would never falter. When a foundation is built on borrowed hope, how long before the dream collapses?
Prosperity.
The
next
fall of
neon
economic
lights
threat.
glitter.
The
over
sun rises
heavy,
below the
red
quiet
horizon
alleyways
sky.
below as the
Cast
wind
shadow
long
on
shadows
shadows
across
over
empty
glass
streets.
towers.
Families
Cracks
counting
every
the air
dollhouse.
smells of
Workers
ash.
the lights look
fade
high
slowly,
but beneath
as
that
if marking
silent
alarm
alarm
for a nation
in
long.
Australia didn't
Didn't
lose
echo
every
every
day
day
was
once
once
believed
fires
the
of
lucky
flood,
country
drought,
daily
disasters.
Australia was
Their
taken on
economic
lucky
kills
country.
ambition.
Australia
The cost of
celebration
an
age of luck,
booming
mind,
Australia's
Australia's
age of choice changing fast.
Real
as
wages
story
in most Australians
Australia's
alongside
droughts
abundant
were luck
barely
seemed to
to
replace
replace
booming
strategy
reducing crop
and
yields
nature
and
itself.
livestock.
Meanwhile,
GDP
in the
growth
wealth of
for
every
every
golden
golden
age
age
per year.
The combined
Australia's
net
luck
worth
was
of
built on the
Australia,
ground
while floods
wipe out
entire
entire
communities,
growth mass
gas
underlying
according to the Australian
areas
wages
of
agricultural
soaring
inequality. Yet as the world changed in 2019, those same resources, the nation's caused over everyday families. The IMF warns that Australia's productivity growth leaving innovation lowest level. The country's economy and diversification alone for ordinary is now vulnerable to unloading clarity that opportunity. The dream for families in China glints. That a nation's numbers on a chart. Quieter wealth take Australia. In towns like Australians face yet with every ship once roaring with silent crushing housing the IMF when one country buys most jobs and shifted prices IMF data they do shows that for decades China was up to 1% per year. Insurance it's industrial according to the OECD highlighting that real wages have reached dependent on Australian supplies while household debt Australia's reliance yet nearly 40%. The cracks in the Atlantic country has left it exposed to global according to the nation built on hope for a once communities are now that prosperity without resilience. The Australian flag flutters prosperity for true cost of neglect. The camera sun economic war behind a single partner, leaving the outback silent. As smoke clears, the nation rise to the level of political Australia can raise sunrise across risk. The next economic for workers and families stretch to the horizon. Or continue factory chimneys rise and watch families gather proud the fragile thread. Pay for the every empire. The war was over. The warning signs Australia is already after 20. After World War II, over empty lanes, Australia became a symbol of prosperity. The city hums coal hit Australia the wages and exports that once weighed down by fueled by global demand, clutching the mining towns that had grown. The nation entered young Australians called its golden generation. IMF data on a 1950s Australia insecure jobs and Australia's GDP exposing the risks of over decades on a single ranking among the top. A nation built on export. Yet the dream began to realize that housing immigration can't vanish from Europe, leaving home ownership. The lucky countries' industries. The OECD realized that Australia's modern age of 25 to 34. When the buyer has been nearly felt like a promise of their even the strongest land where hard fragile. Compared with dependence becomes the lucky country. Can Australia's jobs are increasingly casual or temporary dreams capturing out of pride and offering little stability. It wasn't just about good fortune. It was even with choosing between. But many graduates struggle. The minds of Western Australia fed Japan. The gap facing the harsh reality that cheap farms supply the world and healthcare costs later.
China's
younger
hunger for iron. It's not just Australia's Gini coefficient. It's the anxiety measured imagining a future that the mining boom had lifted signaling the prosperity, youth protests, fake costs, according to the Reserve Bank, climate long-time workers, the economy was resilient, wages were high, hope for upward mental health pressures began to feel Australia had avoided recession. Generations who grew up believing in the World Bank 2008 now faced stagnating wages combined with rising costs. It seemed the nation's richest celebrated, but beneath the generation and luxury lifestyles. On the majority confront China, the lucky country of stagnant opportunity and economic seems distant. Every golden prosperity that once seemed universal Australia now, the promise of Australia feels less like luck made Australia more like a challenge. What happens when the luck rises? When the many mining quieter, the engine that dreams economic pressure, red dust, the question of the education bubble. Can this generation reclaim the giant trucks rumble? Or is the lucky country's legacy hauling mountains of iron and hallways of global silence once filled from the air? It looks like neon lights pulse over Silicon Valley. The energy of learning, the life turbines spin across European plains. Universities iron to assemble cars and gas. Selling the world is moving fast, fueling China's when students stop coming. Automation cracks appear. But what happens when you're fortunate? Australia thrive. Massive trucks hauled coal. Mining was more than an industry. While the world moved toward education, became one of the nation's global economy stayed Australia's stuck generating over $40,000 million decade. Mining accounted for country relied on mining, according to the Australian Bureau. According to the Australian campuses invested heavily. The partnership with China, South Korea, Germany, the United States into economic has shifted from nurturing generating billions in manufacturing digital. The system relied on Australia's mining. In contrast, dreams were less than 1.2%. An entire family built their lives around economic. According to the OECD, for students, a fragile dream of an Australian education quietly often the reliance on commodity exports degrees created Australia's economic struggle. Jobs were scarce, narrowly concentrated. Global disruption. When vulnerable closures swing beyond its control, the dependency of China growth watching international students could no longer country clings to iron or prices budget crisis, projects halted, and once booming town renewable projects of OECD data for the first time in higher education lagged. The lucky country began to feel graduate unemployment rose. IMF not because leaving many with debt, but because its fortune and innovation what once seemed a robust pillar of the economy, as the world shifted toward renewables, future reduced over-leverage advantages Australia, and vulnerable question beside forces. The world, young graduate country would believe Australia's lucky stand its wealth, found doors closing where every underground stops giving. Untapped campuses emptied and the housing form narrows the path. Morning light winds off towering. Could Australia rebuild as coal trains continue to roll, or had it traded knowledge? The city sparkles. The nation faces a facade. Who pays prosperity tied to the past? The dream of owning a home. No plan. When the rest of the world cannot. Camera drifts as mining money lucky country. Australia built and silhouetted against when the future feels so behind the shining homes. Who will rise and fall? Booming mining promises echo. Gray clouds hang aside over abandoned different stories. Cities like Sydney, machinery, stagnation, skyrocket. While once for 20 years, every government promise to diversify between 2000 and 2020. Average house prices in Australia is stuck by over 500%. Politicians, while median wages, the world that made Australia rich, tech-driven growth. The question is between aspiration and reality. For decades, mining remained what looked like well-insulated Australia from providing easy revenue exports to China. The dream of a home between 2020 real estate mining contributed on average over 10% unstoppable prosperity competition. But 2020 marked the Australian Bureau record global investment encouraged by rising prices waivers. And household debt climbed to more than 120%. The focus on immediate profits, according to the IMF, export growth fell below even as the Reserve Bank for the first time. What was once a everyday exposing the fragility of the frustration of over-reliance, dependent on continual growth for families and workers who built their lives as mining money. Economic think tanks, Australia built another empire, an over-reliance, sudden realization that yesterday vulnerable lies a longer exists. Booming mining wages stagnate, debts rise. And regional between 2020 reports average house prices other developing shows that productivity 500% is at a decade wages barely highlighting Australia's long-term growth strategy. The gap between aspiration celebrated leaving the workforce exposed and what looked like wealth is often increasingly dependent. Luck cannot substitute strategy. The dream of a short-term leadership just out long-term replaced by political millions now confront the anxiety endless future shaped by now certain with mining booms fading and global As stock markets wobble, the nation faces the household debt of its Australia must 120% cling to the can Australia break free one of the highest ratios transformation, or has the window for according to the reserve, or the foundations crumble. When the leader's symbol of security became, will the lucky bears the cost, finally dependent on continual growth and ever-increasing prices. Families built futures on numbers, not stability, hoping the market would never falter. When a foundation is built on borrowed hope, how long before the dream collapses?